AutomationEdge workflows can capture business or IT processes for automation. You can also create loops in the workflows. Hi, I'm Seema from AutomationEdge Professional Services. In this video, I will showcase Process Studio loop steps, start loop and continue loop, to loop rows of data based on conditions or iteration counts. Let us begin. The plugin steps for implementing loop in Process Studio workflows include start loop, continue loop, and break loop. In this video, I will talk about start loop and continue loop steps, and I will talk about break loop in my next video. Start loop and continue loop are steps in the AutomationEdge core plugin. Start loop and continue loop steps execute as a pair. The two steps in a pair have the same color. If you add or drop any other pair in the workflow, it'll have a new color for the pair. The start loop and continue loop loop rows of data based on conditions or iteration count. The start loop step marks the beginning of loop execution. Start and continue loop steps execute as a pair. If you add a start loop step in a Process Studio workflow, it automatically drops a continue loop step. You can configure the loop properties in the start loop step. First of all, let me mention the sequential property. By default, steps in a workflow execute in parallel. However, the steps in a loop execute sequentially, with a single row of data at a time. The other input rows are paused until a continue signal is received from the continue loop step. The same input row is passed for each iteration of that particular row. The start loop step has a provision to add additional fields. Additional fields may be updated during loop iteration and are available after the loop iteration. All other fields generated by steps during loop iteration are destroyed. That is, their scope is valid only for the particular iteration. The number of loop iterations depends on a loop condition or a loop iterator. The start loop step provides a dynamic condition block. Based on the output of the condition, the loop routes the input row to either continue to the next row in case of condition failure, or performs the loop steps in case of condition success. Alternatively, you can define a loop iterator with an iterator name and number of iterations. The iterator creates an implicit counter starting from 0 for the first loop iteration and increments by 1 for each loop iteration thereafter. There are two output hops for true and false conditions from the start loop step. It is mandatory to have the continue loop step at the end of the true path. We will see all these options in the demo. The continue loop step. A start loop step automatically creates or drops a continue loop step on the workflow canvas. It only contains the start loop step name. The step continues to the start loop step for further decision making about conditions or iterations for the current or next rows. It passes all the additional fields defined in the start loop or populated in the loop steps at the end of a loop iteration. It increments the counter before forwarding the row. Let us look at the start loop and continue loop configuration options in Process Studio. I'm in Process Studio. I have created a blank workflow loop. Let us drag and drop the start loop step. As you can see, dropping a start loop step automatically drops a continue loop step. Let us look at the properties of the start loop. Double-click to open the properties. The first is the step name. You can give a suitable step name with step name abbreviation followed by a descriptive name of the loop. Say if the purpose of the loop is to calculate factorial, then you can mention factorial. A loop name is generated automatically. The next is a checkbox, conditional loop. Enable the checkbox if you wish to loop based on a condition. It is a kind of a while loop based on the condition. If you enable it, the next two fields are disabled. That is the iterator name and number of iterations. So there are two possibilities with the start loop step. You can configure it as a conditional loop or leave it unchecked to enable the iterator fields, that is iterator name and number of iterations. The iterator loop is like a for loop. In the iterator name, provide a suitable iterator name, and in the number of iterations, provide an integer value for the number of iterations of each input row. We will see both the examples. a conditional loop, and an iterator loop. Before I actually show a demo of the loops, let us discuss the other fields. Next, we have the table additional fields. In this table, you can define additional fields. Additional fields are added as columns to the row. They are permanent and visible even after the loop. However, if you define any fields within the steps in a loop, they are not permanently available after loop execution. Only additional fields specified in the start loop step are available even after loop execution. Provide the names of additional fields you wish to define in the table. Select a data type from the list, such as number, string, date, boolean, and so on. Depending on the type, select the appropriate format. You can provide a default value for the additional field. And in the set empty string, you can set yes or no. If a default value is not provided, set the empty string to yes. This sets a null value in the empty string. The next is the conditions block. The fields in the conditions block are enabled only if the conditional loop checkbox is checked. Else the fields are disabled. Now let us first see a conditional loop. For a conditional loop, you can define additional fields and create conditions. In the conditions block, you can use fields. Currently, there are no fields to use as there is no incoming data. To understand the conditional loop, let me create a context in the workflow. I will define input fields for incoming data and I will define steps in the loop for iteration. So let me say OK. I have created the context of a calculate factorial workflow. Factorial of a number is the multiplication of all the numbers from 1 to the number itself. I have defined an Excel input step containing the list of numbers to calculate factorial. I have added a modified JavaScript step to define a variable count with initial value 0 to use as a counter in the workflow by incrementing it with 1 in the loop. Now let us come to the loop. I'm going to create a conditional loop. First of all, let me define an additional field, say fact. To store the factorial of the number, I will select type as integer since it is a whole number. You can specify a format. Let me provide a default value 1. Since I have a default value, there is no need to set empty string to null, hence I'll say no. I will use the additional field in the loop to store the factorial value with every iteration in the loop. And it will be available after the loop as well. Now let us go to the conditions block. The first is a boolean field. You can leave it blank or you can toggle to specify a not condition. I will leave it blank. Now I want to set a condition where count is less than the test number in the Excel file to calculate factorial. So let me click on field. I can see the list of incoming fields. The test number is from Microsoft Excel file. We defined the count in the modified JavaScript, and the fact is the additional field we defined in the table above. Now in my condition, let me specify count is less than, and for the value you can select a field or you can directly specify a value. If you click on value, you can directly select the type and enter the value. I will cancel it. I will select the value from the field that is test number. So I have configured the start loop, click OK. Now in the loop steps, I have a modified JavaScript step to calculate factorial. Here I increment the count by 1 for every iteration. I have defined a variable, myFact, which is assigned the value of fact, and I calculate the factorial by multiplying it to the count. Since count is 0 to start with, I increment the counter from 1 to the number itself. Let me cancel, and I update the factorial value with the variable myFact that we defined. So now let us connect the loop to the loop steps. It has two options, condition true and condition false. Now this is the main input step, so I will specify condition true. Now let us look at the continue loop step. The continue loop step continues to the start loop step for further decision making regarding iterations or conditions. It only contains the start loop step name. Provide a suitable step name or leave it to the default. In the loop name, it automatically picks a loop name based on the associated start loop step. So I will click OK. And the continue loop has to be at the end of a true hop. So let me connect it to continue loop. Now the other hop is the false hop. In my case, I will connect the false hop to a text file output step to store the number and its factorial. Let us execute the workflow. Now let me click on the calculate factorial and preview data. You can see that it performs iterations from count 1 to 7 to calculate the factorial value. Similarly for all the other numbers, and in the text file output, it stores only the number and the factorial value. Since it is outside the loop, it doesn't store every loop iteration. I have added a note to the workflow, calculate factorial with conditional loop. There could be several use cases to use the conditional loop. One such use case is GUI automation, where you can click an element such as next page until the element is enabled. That is up to the last page. Now let us see how to define a loop with Iterator. I have modified the workflow for calculate factorial with conditional block to change it for the Iterator loop. Now let us configure the start loop. So this time let us define an iterator, say ITR, and in the number of iterations you can provide a value, variables, or you can select from the drop down list. So I wish to iterate equal to the number value for which I wish to calculate the factorial. Just like in the earlier workflow, let me define an additional field fact to store the factorial value. It is of the type integer since it is a whole number, and select a format, provide a default value, and set empty string to no since we have provided a default value. So this completes the configuration of the start loop step. Now you need to connect the start loop step to the loop steps. So I will connect it to the main loop steps with the condition true. As discussed, continue loop should be in the true hop path as the last step. So let us connect the loop steps to the continue loop step. And for the false hop, let us connect it to a text file output to store the factorial values. Save your workflow and let us execute it. Let us preview the data. As you can see, the iterator starts from 0 and continues up to 6. So the counter or iterator in the calculate factorial modified JavaScript actually moves from 1 to the number itself. And let us see the output in the text file. You can see it has calculated the factorial for each number in the Excel file. Let us recap. We saw the start loop and continue loop steps, description and configuration options. You can jumpstart your digital transformation journey with AutomationEdge. You can quickly capture business or IT processes in AutomationEdge workflows with the innumerous pre-built plugin steps.